Welcome to the Untypical Parent Podcast, where doing things differently is more than okay. I'm Liz Evans and I am the Untypical OT and I am your host. I'm here to open up conversations that go beyond the stereotypical child, parent and family. This is your go-to space to find your backup team, the people who truly get it, because we were never meant to do this alone. Each week, through a mix of guest interviews and solo episodes, we'll explore a wide range of topics because every family is unique and there's no one size fits all when it comes to parenting. But before we dive in, if you're enjoying what I share and want to support the podcast, you can buy me a cuppa. You'll find all the links in the show notes. Are you ready? Come join me. This podcast episode is proudly sponsored by Something Profound. They create funny t-shirts, mugs and more, specifically designed for neurodivergent people and those with chronic illnesses, because we all deserve a good laugh. A lovely friend of mine gifted me a mug that says, "Not enough spoons to give a fork," and every time I use it, it makes me smile. It's such a great reminder to embrace the chaos with a little bit of humour. Want to grab your own or know a friend who could do with a laugh? Head over to somethingprofound.co.uk and use the code LIZUOT. It's case sensitive, so you'll need to use capital letters for your 15% off your order. And don't forget to follow Sam, the founder of Something Profound. You'll find her on Instagram and Facebook at something_profound_clothing. If you've got something to say it with something profound. Today, we've got the lovely Ruth Jones joining me on the podcast. Ruth is an independent speech and language therapist working across Wiltshire and Somerset in the UK. Her work involves direct work with individuals, families, and education settings. Additionally, she delivers training to therapists and settings and offers clinical supervision to other speech and language therapists. She works primarily with neurodivergent children and young people and those who require additional support to access meaningful opportunities and their education. Ruth believes in child-led and neurodiversity-informed practice, and her core values are around acceptance, curiosity, and connection. Ruth feels purposeful about using her role to challenge and encourage change in the field of speech and language therapy, and more widely within education settings and society to better improve outcomes for neurodivergent individuals. Ruth, welcome to the podcast. Ruth, thank you ever so much for joining me on the podcast, the Untypical Parent Podcast. It's wonderful to have you with me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
It's nice to, so we've kind of linked up over the internet, so over social media. So for all the negatives that are around social media, actually, this is how we've linked up, is through social media. And sometimes that's when social media can be totally amazing.
Yeah, for sure. It's nice, like that shared values and kind of connections that you can make with people that you would never have met in, like real physical life. So it's great.
So it's great. And it's always nice to speak to another fellow kind of health professional who has our background. So I'm an occupational therapist and Ruth, as you know from the intro, is a speech and language therapist. We always start this series, Ruth, with the same question to everybody. I don't even give them a chance to get in and too comfy. The first question I ask everybody is, are you the perfect parent, Ruth?
You know what? I've been thinking about this and like listening to your podcast and when people get asked, and I'm always taken back to some training that I sat in, I don't know, probably 6, 7 years ago from a clinical psychologist on attachment. And
Yep.
she used the phrase, she talked about the concept of being a good enough parent. And I was like, when I hear you ask people this question, I'm like, there is no perfect parent, but I think we are good enough. And so I hold on to that and I'm like, yeah, even in those moments where I feel like it's catastrophically going wrong with my kids, I'm like, but I'm doing my best and that is good enough. So I think that sort of that concept is quite sort of a calming and soothing one for
Yeah.
parents when you're feeling a bit dysregulated.
And it's funny that, isn't it? Because you hear that a lot in the world of attachment is about that being a good enough parent. And, you're talking about, sometimes when kids are being removed from their parents and stuff like that. I think you'd have to correct me. I went and did some training as well, like you, but I think there was something around the law as well around parenting. And it's about the threshold is being good enough
Yes.
as a parent. But funnily enough, that's not a concept a lot of us parents hold as being good. We don't, it's not okay to be good enough. We have to be
Yeah.
up high, like perfect parent.
Yeah.
Um, and you hear, as you say, you hear it spoken about a lot in attachment, the world of attachment and
Mm.
trauma and that kind of thing,
Yeah.
but actually in the everyday life. And I think that's really important. You're the first person to bring that up on the
Oh,
podcast, is the good enough parent.
yeah.
Um, and it's really important that, and we don't hear that talked about a lot in general day-to-day parenting.
No, no. I find a lot of the parents of, that I support, I will be like, you are doing your best and this is hard. Like
Yeah.
it is hard navigating the systems that are not built for you and your kids, the schooling, and that's before you're actually even supporting and parenting your child at home. There's all these different things and, you know, all anyone is ever doing is their best, and that is good enough. And I
Mm.
think there's that thing that we just kind of have to hold on to, don't we? And it doesn't mean we don't need support with it. It doesn't mean we don't need respite. It doesn't mean we don't need that, community of people around us, whether that's friends, family, other professionals. We lean into the kids' teacher, a network of other parents that we meet, listening to podcasts where you can share experiences and feel validated. But I think, yeah, that's sort of the concept of just being good enough. And so I feel like I am good enough.
Yeah.
And, sometimes you just got to say that out loud,
Yeah.
like sit with that and hear it and be like, yeah, I am.
Yeah. And when you got that piece of information, were you already a parent at that point, or did you get that before? Oh, so you got that in before.
Yeah, I was actually, I think I was pregnant with my eldest, and she's 6 now. So it was a while ago. I remember sitting in this school. In fact, I was definitely pregnant because now I'm thinking back to it and taking myself into that memory. It was in a school hall and we were all sat on like these uncomfortable like
Um,
benches, and I
yeah.
was pregnant, so I think I was like even more uncomfortable. But attachment is something that often comes up, particularly around like autism. And there's like a grid called the Coventry grid that looks at the similarities between autism and attachment. And so in my kind of professional experience, it's something that's come up a lot, is like with the presentation of children, might that be sort of attachment difficulties, might that be autism? And so I think it's something that's I've been in multiple trainings about, but that one hit differently because I
Yeah.
was sat there going, I'm going to be a parent soon. And like, oh gosh, I want to do the best I can to be
Yeah.
good enough,
Yeah.
to kind of, yeah, form those secure attachments. And I think, I did the best I could based on the information that I had. And I have a 6-year-old who still won't be left anywhere without me. So, take that as it
And I
is.
wonder whether it almost, the fact that you got that information before you became a parent was actually really important. And it's almost like they could do with putting that into NCT classes.
Oh my
Forget about
God.
birth plans that you never
Yeah.
actually get to follow.
No.
Actually, what might be a really good thing to talk about in an NCT class, are you, being good enough?
Yeah, yeah. Like, and actual parenting, because I
Yeah.
think it's all about like how to change a nappy. And don't get me wrong, like that is helpful, isn't it? Like
Yes. Yeah.
practical advice is very good.
Yep.
But also things like understanding the nervous system and like
Mm,
your child's like their perspective and how they're like, the different parts of their brain are going to be hitting and when they develop. And one of the things I often will talk about with, it's usually with staff within schools, but sometimes it's with parents too, is the concept of this bit at the front of our brains that like controls our inhibition, our impulses, is like part of our personality and our emotional regulation. Like it can still be developing up to 25 to 30, and we're like holding 6, 7, 8 year olds to account on this thing that some 25, 26,
yeah.
27 year olds don't even have, and I
Yeah.
think that stuff would be really helpful as parents,
Yeah. It would be,
to
wouldn't it?
help us support our kids in those moments.
I feel quite strongly about that, I think, from a parental perspective, is actually the support we get to be parents. There isn't any. It's, as you say, the NCT, it's about the practicalities, it's about the actual birth itself. And as I said, that very rarely goes according to plan. Um, but actually, the day to day, being a parent and what that means and the skills that you might need to be able to do that,
Yeah,
no one tells you about it. You have to kind of pick it up along the way. You
yeah,
make it up along the way. You get it wrong and learn along the way.
yeah,
Um, and there's no handbook. I don't believe there is a kind of, oh, this is how you do it. But it's being able to have those conversations really early on in your parenting, I think is really important. And I didn't get that. You just learn the hard way as you kind of go along.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, even once your child's like a little bit older and they're maybe in early years provisions and they're kind of, on that kind of into early experiences of other adults supporting them rather than it just being parents, there's still not lots of support for parents. If,
No.
it might be like we're noticing some differences, we'll make a referral and you're like, okay, but what do we like, can somebody give me something? And, I know some early years settings are incredible at saying, so we're going to try this in setting, like you guys can do that at home, that sort of stuff. But I think, yeah, that kind of is the lens, isn't it? I feel so strongly about like how are you viewing the children in front of you? And I think that as professionals, we kind of have this privileged space where it's part of our job to learn to do things differently. But as parents, if you don't know where to find that information, like even things like NCT, like that costs money, the financial privilege to attend the courses or buy the books or not work that afternoon to
Yeah,
go and do do the course or whatever it is. I think, yeah, there's a lot of barriers
yeah.
in front of parents to then learning and understanding about their kids. And I think particularly like for, neurodivergent children, those differences in communication styles, like those differences in how they regulate their emotions, their sensory systems, their attention, all of those kinds of
Mm.
things that, yeah, it's just not there. And it's something that I think as therapists, there's like a responsibility that we have. But again, there's still barriers. If you're just one therapist, then you're working with a whole host of, huge caseloads, like how you can navigate that and do your best
Yeah.
and share information. But often what parents really would love is just to sit down to really talk about their child, isn't it? Because I think you can
Yeah.
like you're like generic information is great, but what do I do when
Yeah.
X is doing
Yeah.
Y? How do I apply
Yeah.
this knowledge then?
Yeah. And I think some of the work that I do is around, being able to support parents themselves, is getting to know what they need as a
Yeah.
person. Because obviously sometimes in neurodivergent families, when you've got neurodivergent children, there might be some neurodivergence in us as
Yeah.
adults, but haven't had that support, and sometimes don't even know. Um, and I think, my piece of work with them is to support parents through that. But it's amazing how quickly, even when we set off with, right, we're going to talk about you, we end up back with the kids
Yeah.
every time. Um, because, and that's what happens as parents.
Yeah.
And I don't give parents a hard time for that. But it's amazing how often that will happen. Even when you set off to talk about the parent, you end up back with the children and
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
the children need. And it's trying to bring the parents back to, yeah, but what do you need?
Yeah. Yeah.
What are
Yeah.
your needs as a parent? And I
Yeah.
suppose what I'm really interested in, Ruth, as well, is just to tell us a little bit about you. So you're a mum.
Yes, I
So
am.
tell us a bit about your family and your setup and who you've got with you.
Yeah. So I have two kids who are 6 and 3 and like so life's very full.
Yeah.
I'm self-employed, so I kind of work my work around the kids and kind of been able to be present to drop them off and pick them up. So I'm really privileged to be able to do that. Before they came along, I've worked in residential special schools for autistic children. Um, and yeah, and then my husband does nothing like what I do. He's like in contaminated land.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow, that's a real difference.
yeah, it is. It is very much like he's like the brains of the like, like he's the scientist, the organized
Yeah.
one, and I'm just like the, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to describe myself, but yeah, we have definitely very different career paths and interests, I suppose.
Yeah.
But I definitely think like within my parenting, I take my professional like lens through which all of the children I support are neurodivergent children. I work in special
Mhm.
schools and resource spaces, and I support autistic children in mainstream. Um, and I take all of that into my parenting, I think, and um, trying to be good enough with that view. And actually, sometimes that's really hard when I spend all day doing my
Yeah.
job to the best of my ability and wanting not just to be good enough as a therapist, wanting to be the best I can be for that child. I get home for my kids and I'm like, yeah, I
Nothing
can't
left
put the
now.
TV on.
And that's really interesting as well that you say you kind of bring in those strategies from your work and from your professional experience. And I suppose have you got any diagnosis in your family for your kids?
No,
Okay.
no.
So I was going
So
to say, just bringing that in is really interesting, isn't it? Actually, those techniques and
yeah.
those strategies work across the board for kids.
Yeah, absolutely. I think and that's when I get frustrated when I speak to typically education staff and you say, oh, we can't do that because of everybody else. And I'm
Yeah.
like, but everybody else will really benefit if you
Yeah.
start using those visuals to help the understanding of that one child.
Yeah.
Everybody else will benefit, from a very early age. Like for my daughter, she had like a weekly timetable. So she could see she was across two different early year settings. She could see which days she went where and when was our day off together. And done the same for my son. But um yeah, I think like the way that she shows up, school have kind of mentioned attention and listening, and I don't know, like, jury's out. She's still quite little really to
Yeah.
notice any differences. Say she's definitely a bit quirky. But I think like they're very different and she's very different to my son. And I think what we spend a lot of I spend a lot of time like toying with is like there's the older sibling, younger sibling, there's gender there, and also the fact that she was about 14 months old when COVID started. So she struggles socially. She
Yeah.
really struggles. Like it's taken a long time for her to be confident. She often prefers to have friends with just one person. She struggles in big groups. And you're like, so is that a difference to her
Yeah.
peers, like neurologically, or is that actually something because she didn't have chance to practice those skills at quite a key
Mm.
developmental time?
Are you seeing that a lot, Ruth? I mean, kind of in your work, are you seeing those kids kind of, when I think about those kids coming through COVID now, and when we think about their communication,
Mm,
actually being able to tease out what is that actually they didn't have those experiences when they were younger,
yeah,
and what actually, as you say, is something neurological.
yeah. I think there is a lot around kind of experience and learning and the impact of COVID on so I hate the term social skills because I struggle with that as
Mm.
a concept, but on social communication,
Yeah.
styles and preferences and differences, and also kind of trauma, like, and the impact that that can have on how children show up and actually the kind of the crossover between that and a neurological difference that was present from birth. It's kind of that nature nurture thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And particularly for a lot of children who are now in reception, not even reception, probably like more like year one, year two,
Mm.
they were very little when the lockdowns happened. And so their experience for a good couple of years was not very consistent of being around people.
Yeah.
So I know with my little girl, like when I was on maternity leave, I was like off to the groups. I was like, I'm going to network. I'm going to, like meet people. And so she went everywhere and we did loads of stuff. And then COVID hit and suddenly she didn't
Yeah.
go anywhere. And I have a really vivid memory of meeting up with some very good friends of ours and we went for a walk. It was in that time where, like you could go for a walk with people outside.
Yeah. Yeah. We had to keep a distance and stuff like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah. Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And she stood and faced the hedge for 2 hours. She didn't know how to,
Yeah.
and like, I like went over to her and I'd check in with her and I was doing my like professional parenting, but in my
Yeah.
head, I'm like, I'm being curious, but I have no idea what's going on here. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
I have no idea. Like, she would have been what, like 18 months to, I don't really remember how old she was, but she would have been like younger.
Yeah.
And, we tried like that irresistible invitation. There was cake, there was balls, there was, like, and just, yeah, and now we'd go to their house and she will chat to them and she's
Mm.
more than happy. But that has taken years.
Yeah.
Um, and even the same like with family members and stuff like, and I think is that, as I say, like, is that a neurological difference of social communication and being overwhelmed and not knowing
Mm.
how to navigate it? Or is it that those skills weren't there and now she's getting older, it's getting easier because
Yeah.
she's learning the skills, or is she learning the skills to mask the difficult, it's
Yeah. Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
really
And then you send yourself
complicated.
in a spin, don't you?
Yeah, you do. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Complete.
Can you
I
tell?
think we never know, do we, in the end? I think it's really difficult sometimes, and sometimes it kind of comes out in the wash a bit as they
Yeah.
get a bit older. You kind of think, okay, well, actually, Now we're
Yeah.
seeing that continuing to be an area that
Yeah.
they're finding tricky.
Yeah.
And I think, even from an OT perspective, we see now those kids coming through with, delayed motor skills,
Mm.
issues around their sensory processing. Um, and that's, from people being locked down in the houses and them not being out and about and not using equipment and playgrounds and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it does have a big impact.
It does. And I find like I don't like that wait and see, when people are like, oh, just wait and
Mm,
see what happens. But I find myself being like, well, we'll just have to wait and see, because
yeah.
I'm like, I think there are probably a lot of children, a lot of parents who wonder those things. And actually, if school aren't coming forward with issues, you kind of just have to wait and see. Like, if they're in a mainstream setting, as the schooling expectation heightens as they get
Mm.
further into year two, year three, the length of time they've got to sit still for, the length of
Yeah.
time they've got to focus for, like the amount of time they have to focus on tasks that they're not interested in. Like, then how, as they're getting older, are they navigating that? Because again, that's where that front bit of the brain starts developing to understand, like, actually, I've got to inhibit those things
Yeah.
I want to do. And that's not in a masking way, that's in a neurotypical developmental way, as
Yeah.
opposed to kind of learning. And it's a real nuance, isn't it, I think? And I think it's quite a complex one. And I think also why diagnostic tools and diagnostic processes need to be really robust, particularly at the
Yes.
minute.
Yeah, and to be able to pick out those nuances and know and navigate around that for those assessments, and that's really difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Particularly like, for kids who maybe were 12, 18 months old when all of
Mm.
the lockdown stuff happened. Like,
Not
there's
that
not
happens in
necessarily
that
loads of
time.
indicators. And then, yeah, and then this whole pivotal point in development, social communication development,
Yeah.
particularly, like, and play development, they didn't have the opportunities for
Yeah.
those things. So, I think it definitely has played a part on some of the difficulties and the differences that we see,
Yeah.
in kids in schools.
I
Yeah,
suppose
it's an interesting one.
I'm curious that, if I know your area of expertise and your niche is definitely around the neurodivergent
Hmm.
kids and working alongside the neurodivergent families, is what, as a speech and language therapist, is there something that you really wish that parents knew more around in relation to communication with neurodivergence? Because again, we don't get taught that as parents.
Yeah,
And when we get told our kids are autistic, for example, I got told my son was autistic,
yeah,
and we know with the diagnostics, it's kind of, you wait and wait and wait and wait and wait for this diagnosis, and you get it, and everyone goes, right, see you later.
yeah. Oh,
Like that's the answer, and you're
I
like, you've
know.
right, now I've got that bit of information. What next? But you don't
Yeah.
often get the what next. And I suppose I'm just curious around, what do you wish parents knew when it comes to communication for neurodivergent
Ooh, that
kids?
is a really good one, because obviously, like, it is such a broad range, isn't
Yeah.
it? Like, I work with some 16-year-olds in mainstream doing their GCSEs, and I work with some, 7, 8, 9-year-olds who are non-speaking. So it's a
Yeah.
real broad range. I think for me, as a therapist, in my approach, and what I would often talk to parents about, is honoring all forms of communication.
Yeah.
So whether that is your 16-year-old doing their GCSEs who talks really formally and it feels a bit unusual if you're a neurotypical, just honor it. Like, that's really cool they have that vocabulary. Equally, if you've got a 3-year-old who's non-speaking and they reach and point for something and you know what it is they want, take that as their communication. Don't feel like you've got to shift and change these things. Like, we have to scaffold communication for those kids, but like, I don't think I could say that honestly in my 13 years of working with neurodivergent kids, I've never met a child who does not want to communicate in some form. And it's about honoring the way that they are communicating.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, like, exploring communication and what is fun for them and what's interesting to them. Like, I did some inset day training just before the Easter holiday with the team at a school. And we were talking about, it's a specialist provision for children, neurodivergent children, kind of with more kind of the social, emotional, mental health challenges that show up through neurodivergence. And we were talking about how they come in the morning, teenage boys, head on the desk, and I'm like, and so what do you do? And they're like, oh, hi, how are you? And I'm like, right, so let's just honor their communication right now. If they've come in and their head's on the desk, your neurotypical teacher head has been like, we need to get on with the lesson, like, show me you're listening,
Yeah.
all of that sort of stuff. And I'm like, just honor what's going on in that moment. Like something is going on for that individual. They're communicating something. So giving them, my supervisor, Kate, often uses she kind of has the phrase, which I hold on to a lot, is giving them language for their experience. So
Okay.
I think even, and that again fits the whole spectrum, honor their communication. If they don't have language for that experience, try and give them some. So
Yeah.
whether that is your 3, 4 year old non-speaking child and you can give them a sign or a symbol, a picture, an object for the things they're trying to communicate, that is language. Through to your teenager whose language is probably something a little bit more explicit about how you need to leave them alone for 5 minutes,
Yeah.
but give them some language for that, even if it's like, oh, let's take five, because
Yeah.
actually, if they can come in and feel honored, that's gonna help regulate their nervous system, and they're gonna feel safer in those environments. And I think for parents, yeah, honor and then give them language.
Okay. And I'm just suppose there are a lot of kind of myths, I think, around communication,
Mm.
and around neurodivergent communication and styles, and often lots of myths around you as speech and language therapists and what you actually do, along with what we do as like occupational therapists, because no one
Yeah,
has a clue a lot of the time about what we do. Something sensory sometimes if you've
yeah,
got kids, but other than that, are you a bit like a physio? Um,
yes,
but I think for in all the years that I've worked alongside as a speech and language therapist, is often there is this thing that, my son or daughter or young person, child doesn't need a speech and language therapist because they can talk. And speech and language, yeah. If you can't see Ruth, if you're on audio, she's just pulled the greatest face.
yeah. That's
I'm going to
not a
let you
phrase I
run with that
relate
one,
with.
Ruth.
Yeah. Yeah, and like kids who are discharged or don't have any speech and language needs on their education, health, and care plan,
Yeah.
but they have communication differences. And it doesn't mean they need like one-to-one speech therapy, an hour a week for the rest of their life. But I would argue that all neurodivergent individuals need an assessment from a speech and language therapist. And that doesn't have to look like a formal assessment of language. I actually actively avoid those at all costs if possible. But kind of a little dive into their understanding, into their perspective on things, and particularly for kind of those lower, medium, low support needs individuals who have spoken language, actually just finding out a bit about how do they advocate for themselves. I think that is a really important thing, is like actually how do you tell somebody if your sensory system's on fire and you need to take five, if
Mm.
you don't understand something that somebody said to you, like if you feel like there's a bit of miscommunication, or you know so often the one I hear is that like, oh, but they're just being like, they're just rude, because actually like autistic communication particularly is like super direct,
Mhm.
okay? And like they're not being rude, and actually for some of those who are really empathetic, they would find it really hard to have upset someone just because they were talking in a way that they talk. They don't, like it's
Mm.
just communication, isn't it? And I
Yeah.
think like rudeness is such like a social construct. And I think actually like autistic communication is a bit like a punch in the guts while also being incredibly like liberating.
Yeah.
On the receiving end, you're a bit like, oh, and then I'm like, oh my gosh, I'd love to just say
Yeah.
what I'm thinking.
Yeah. But even when I think about, across different cultures,
Yeah,
and the way that they will talk. Sometimes, sometimes the Americans and the way they view our communication, they think we're a bit, we're always apologizing and everything's our
yeah,
fault and we're ever so sorry.
yeah,
And we might find Americans very blunt. Sometimes I'm being very stereotypical. If there's any
yeah,
Americans listening, I am being very stereotypical. I apologize. But sometimes it's interpreted, they might be a little bit more blunt than we are. Um, and it's really interesting you say that, I think, because my son's autistic and he has this wonderful way of cutting through the crap and
yeah,
will just tell me how it is. Sometimes it's very direct and to the point. But
yeah,
what I worry for him is that he has become very anxious around checking with me now. Have I upset somebody? And now he constantly worries about what he can say. And I'm just like, don't worry about it. Just if that's what you want to say, you go for it and say
Yeah.
it. We're mindful of other people, but if you're not setting out to be horrible and rude to somebody, but it's that again, it's going back to that social skills training, isn't it? That we've got to try and make autistic people fit into the neurotypical way of communicating. And actually, he's just got a different way of communicating. It's not wrong. He's not horrible. It's
Hmm.
just direct.
Yeah.
But he's now super anxious about that. And I worry about that for him as a teenager now, being
Mm.
very hard on himself. And he'll often double check with, and he doesn't say things now to people because he's not sure if the offence will be taken by. Because I'll often say to him,
Yeah.
why didn't you say that? And he goes, oh, because I was worried I was going to upset them. Or I might have been being rude. And
Yeah.
that's not come from me as a family. That's not how we operate. But
Mm.
somehow he's taken that in from society,
Yeah.
and his
Yeah.
learning is that I have to be really careful with what I say all the time. And he worries about that now.
I think that's it, isn't it? And actually, like a speech and language therapist, particularly a neuro-affirming committed therapist would come in
Mm,
and be thinking like, okay, so you want to have those interactions and you're not doing them. And there's a barrier which is around that anxiety. So how can we look at the driving factors? Like, where's this coming from? Like, what experiences have you had where that's gone wrong for you? And therefore it's kind
mm,
of driving that belief in you that I shouldn't say things, and then giving some language like, for somebody to be able to advocate, to say something and go, I'm a bit confused by your face. Did I just upset you? I didn't mean to. Or
yeah.
like, I'm autistic. You can expect me in our friendship to sometimes say things in a blunt way. I don't mean to be rude.
I've seen
If I'm
some
going to be rude, I
people.
will tell you.
Yeah, I've seen some people as well now, adults, put on the bottom of their
Yeah.
emails,
Yeah.
it's just a one-liner. I sometimes put it on the bottom of mine about being dyslexic,
Yeah.
but I've seen people do that around their communication styles now as well, which I love because then I know what to expect.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it's great, isn't it? Like we've probably all had that kind of interaction, whether it's with an adult child, face to face or in an email, where you're a bit taken aback because it
Yeah.
isn't a typical way of communicating, whatever that is. And I think it does kind of throw people off a little bit. And actually, if you suddenly had that bit of context, that bit of information, it shapes the lens through which you're viewing them. And I think that's the thing is then as a receiver of that autistic communication, for example, you're going, oh, okay, they're not trying to be rude, they're actually
Yeah.
just direct. And when you shift that and flip that narrative and you look through it with a different lens, suddenly you're like, this is incredible. Like, why do I spend so long thinking of 50 words when I could say five that get me to the same place? Like,
Absolutely.
and yeah, and I don't think that the wider society is ready for that yet, but I
Yeah.
think the little bits that we can do to support those individuals, I think there is much better awareness of autism and ADHD and neurodivergent profiles now. But I still think that kind of acceptance is, an ongoing journey, isn't it? And it would be lovely if we could help the future generation of neurodivergent children, one, be accepting of their communication styles,
Yeah.
and two, be able to advocate for them so that other people can be accepting of them,
Yeah.
and know that their communication as it is good enough, as long as there isn't a barrier, because that's where I think speech therapy can come in, is kind of children get signed off as their language is good enough, but really there's so much more to
Yes.
communication. And yeah, you might have a program on your EHCP that, will be delivered by a trained TA or something. But I think they're the bits that as a therapist, I really struggle seeing in EHCPs, because I know the reality of schools is that for a lot of them, they're going to struggle to find the right staff with the right skill set and
Mm,
to deliver that in a meaningful way, because there are loads of off-the-shelf packages that you can buy and support your child to understand their communication. But what I think a lot of good one-to-one TAs or like ELSAs or speech therapists can do is take those resources and then make it meaningful for the individual that you're working with.
yeah.
And I think that's the important part in that, because sitting down four autistic children in a group and be like, so we're going to talk about this, is not always the most effective way to do things.
Yes, absolutely. I suppose there'll be parents out there listening, Ruth, that, I think parents now, and I think about parents that I've worked with over the years,
Mm.
that parents now are much more informed around the support they can get for their kids. I'm going to say can or could,
Yeah.
because we all know that there are huge waiting lists. And again, privilege around that about, whether you can afford to go private.
Hmm.
A lot of the time when we look through the NHS, we know the NHS is underfunded. We know it's very restricted in what it can deliver and give. Parents are becoming much more knowledgeable about getting EHCPs to be much more quantified and specified, um, that they can get things like speech and language and OT into those.
Hmm.
But it's still tricky to get therapy, speech and language therapy, OT for
Yeah.
kids. I can't tell you, even though I've now kind of moved into working much more with parents, I very rarely see children anymore now. Um, the amount of contact I get from parents saying I'm desperate.
Yeah.
I need an OT, and if you're not doing it, can you tell me someone that does? And I
Yeah.
think it's similar for speech.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. It's like I have like really tangible points over the last few years where I'm now working with children whose parents contacted me before I went off on maternity leave to have my little boy, who's now 3. And that, like, they might have been in touch with me before that, and I've been saying like, no, I'm not taking on new clients at the
Yeah.
minute because I'm going to go off on maternity leave. And then even a year later, when I've come back from maternity leave, they still haven't found a therapist. um I like to think it's because, like, I'm obviously like so knowledgeable that they're like, no, we waited. But the reality is
Best.
not the case. It's just not the case that, therapists are in short supply. They're in
Yeah.
drastically short supply. And I think therapists, like, I constantly find myself thinking, how could I do this better? Like, how could I work with parents in a better way? Could there be some sort of like online support like sessions? But then I think, but I really love to get to know the child and actually be able to, I need to know the children really well to be able to have those nuanced
Because it's
conversations.
so
And
specific to that child, isn't it? It's
yeah,
it's, it's not going to come out of a textbook. This is what you do. And I think also as well as finding those therapists that are neuroaffirming, trauma responsive,
yeah,
sensory responsive, all that kind of stuff as well, because it's not just a case of finding any therapist that
no,
we know very well. There are some therapists that work in very different ways. Um, and that must be a minefield for parents,
yeah,
trying to
yeah.
find the right therapist.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult. Like, I often signpost there's a couple of registers for speech
Yeah,
and language therapists, like independent speech therapists. One is ASLTIP, which is ASLTIP, and that's the Association for Speech and Language in Independent Practice. There's another one I'm aware of, but don't know much about yet, is SALT Road, where I think they kind of link
okay.
in therapists with different. Um, but again, I know that I've got families that will have contacted me and I've said, oh, go and have a look. And then they come back and go, there's nobody.
Yeah.
And you're like, and I think it is hard because I think also, like, different therapists, like, I would say, like, in my network of speech therapists that I know, my job is quite a very particular job that I do.
Yes.
Like, I've got lots of speech therapy colleagues of mine, friends who work, yes, with neurodivergent children, but they also do in mainstream, they'll be working with
Yeah.
neurotypical children on their language and their sentence structure and their speech sounds. And like, I don't really even know. Like, I'm referring my own little boy for speech sound therapy because I'm like, I don't know. I do not know what is happening. I do not know. All I know is it doesn't sound quite right. So I think there's different kinds of therapists as well, aren't there? And that in itself is then a minefield. Like, what am I looking for? And I have some parents contact me whose children are neurodivergent, but what they want to work on is speech sounds. And
Yeah.
so I'm like, well, actually, that's I'm not the right therapist for you,
Mm,
like, because that's not my area of
mm,
expertise. That's not
mm.
what I know. And so I think that's, again, like with OT, you have some who are sensory integration practitioners, have done their SI training, and then others who haven't and would focus solely on functional
Yeah.
skills for meaningful
You
occupation.
get it
And
going both ways. You'll get some that are very purist in their SI and they
yeah,
are all about the SI therapy, and the other stuff gets missed out, the kind of more functional stuff. And I always talk about it's a toolbox.
yeah,
It depends on the kid that I'm working with, will depend on what I pull from that to support them. It's very rarely ever one thing ever.
yeah,
It's a
yeah.
whole combination of things. And I feel for parents in that
Hmm.
that trying to navigate your way around finding the right therapist. So not only have you now kind of been through, I'm now a parent, then you've
Yeah.
discovered you're now a parent of a neurodivergent child. Then usually somewhere along the lines, you start to go, oh, could I be neurodivergent?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
in that, we'll kind of park that and pin that one to one side for a bit because we had time to deal with that bit.
Yeah.
Um, and then you think, okay, and then you start to learn about, okay, well, what does this mean? They've been
Mhm.
diagnosed autistic, ADHD, dyslexic, whatever it is. Okay, now I've got to drill down into those bits. It's like being a detective,
Yeah.
and then you've got to work out, okay, right, well, how do I now get the support for that? How do I go and find someone to help me with that?
Yeah.
Um, and then you get met with NHS waiting lists, and they don't meet our threshold,
No, no.
rubbishy HCPs, therapists you can't find, or really good therapists that are booked up for the next 3 years and you can't get near them.
Yeah. Yeah. And
And
it
I
is.
don't know what the answer is for those parents, really.
No, no. And they're the parents that I think on all the time that like when I
Yeah.
wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and I'm
Mm,
like, oh, maybe that could work. Or, oh, but I think like arguably like knowledge is helpful. But
yes.
I think so often what parents really value is that space to talk about their child, isn't it? Like
Yes.
they can read a book, they can attend the course, but what does that look like in my home
How do
with
I
my
apply it?
child? What do
Yeah.
I actually do with that?
Yeah.
And I think that's the bit is like as a therapist, what I'd often do is like assess a child, if they're at home, like assess them at home or at school,
Mm,
kind of take away, reflect on what I've seen, think about what the goals might be, what does the child want to achieve if they're able to tell us. Um, and then often work alongside parents and in the home with them and their child and work alongside the school in the classroom. Like, you very rarely see me taking a child out of a classroom. Like I'm in the classroom thinking about what this looks like. Again, that's kind of where the functional side comes in, right?
hmm
But it's then about like getting to know that child. And then when the parents are sending me like messages going, oh, this has just happened, isn't this incredible? Or oh, this has just happened, how do we navigate it? You can actually
Yeah.
come to that with some meaningful advice because you know the scenarios within which the children, and that's where I constantly struggle, like that maybe there is scope to do something online and support parents, but if you don't have that knowledge, you could be, even of things like their sensory differences, what works for one child won't work for another because they're hyposensitive and another one's
Yeah.
hypersensitive to a particular sensation. And so all of those things are so, it makes it really hard, I think, for me to see the wood for the trees where I'm like, there's all these parents, but what do I actually do
Mm,
to help, and how could I
mm,
do something
yeah.
that's meaningful?
Yeah. I suppose that kind of leads me on to thinking about Ruth, and I think, kind of how we usually tie up the end of the podcast is thinking about, I'm interested in two things, I suppose, is
Mhm.
as a parent, you kind of had this golden nugget bit of information that you had before you hit about being good enough.
Yeah.
But because what I'm curious about is have you always kind of felt quite confident as a parent? Or if I was to say to you, Ruth, go back to when you were a younger parent, so maybe 5, 6 years ago, just as your kind of kids were being born, is there a bit of advice you'd go back and give yourself back then?
Mhm. I think that's a really good question. I actually find parenting harder as they get older. I feel like those newborn days where I'm like, right, I can sort of narrow down what the problem is and it's very tangible. And if all else fails, I'll just cuddle you until
Yep.
whatever the problem is has gone away
Yep.
that I can't find out. And so that I think for me, what I would go back and tell myself is that you don't always have the answer and to treat yourself as well as your kids with kindness
Yeah.
because it's very easy to treat them with kindness for the most of the time. And
Yeah.
it's very, very hard to do the same for yourself and not feel
Yeah.
like after that moment where, you've lost it because things have just been too much or you're just struggling to get out of them what the problem is and you find your own frustration taking over. It's very hard to not walk away from that and think, oh God, I
Yeah.
got that wrong.
Yeah.
And so I think treating yourself with as much kindness as you treat your kids is, and that it's okay to say sorry because that in itself is a learning opportunity.
It's huge, that one, isn't it? I think I
Hmm.
feel really strongly about the sorry one. I say sorry to my kids a lot, and
Yeah.
not because, well, I do mess up a lot, but I hope no more than normal parents.
No.
Um, but I'm very quick to say I'm sorry to my kids and
Mm,
say I'm really sorry, and then I can explain a bit about why that might have happened.
yeah.
And sometimes it's okay that that's what happened, and sometimes it's not okay. And I can say it
Mm,
wasn't okay, even though you did this and that upset me, or wasn't okay that I then shouted or whatever. And
yeah.
I'm really sorry that I did that.
Yeah.
And I feel really strongly about the word sorry with my kids. And some parents are they don't want to apologize because they feel that they're
Mm,
the parent and they shouldn't have to apologize to their children. And
mm.
I think if we get it wrong, we should.
Yeah, definitely. And like, sorry is not something I've ever made my kids say.
No,
Like, I might invite the opportunity, but I would say, I mean, my daughter's a bit different. But like my son at 3, he will then go, "Oh, sorry, mama." And like, I've never made him say sorry, but if he does something by accident, like, he will still, he's picked up on that and he's learning that from somewhere.
yeah,
And I think that's because he's seeing it in the environment around
yeah,
him. Um, and sometimes I don't say sorry for a while because I know I need to calm myself down. Because if I go back in and
yes,
try to say sorry, I'll be like, well, the reason I didn't is because you did this, and it all
yeah,
starts over again. So, sometimes it might be at the end of the day at bedtime, and
yeah,
I'm like, I'm sorry that I shouted at you earlier because of this. Like, the noise was too much for me. I was trying to do 3 different jobs. You
yeah,
were both talking. I didn't even know who was saying what at each time. And that was too much for my body and my brain. And what I should have done is maybe step away or, put my earplugs in or whatever. Um, and calmed myself down and
yeah,
regulated myself to then be able to help you guys. And I think that's one of the trickiest things about parents, isn't it? Is that actually, particularly with younger kids, that even then they don't understand that. Like, I've tried to be like, I just need a minute, I need to walk away, and then they follow you.
I do.
I tried.
Yeah, it's when you're in the toilet holding onto the
Yeah,
door, going, "No, you can't come in,
I need to breathe. Let me
mummy."
regulate. Absolutely. And I'm like, I'm trying here to calm myself so I can deal with this well, but you're
Yeah,
not helping.
deep breathing on the other side of the toilet door.
Yeah. Tracing some like stars or some like, figure of 8 breathing.
Yeah, they do have an amazing ability to do that, don't they?
Yeah.
If you had a top tip, uh, Ruth, and it can be like just a general parenting one, or it might be speech and language therapy related.
Mm,
What would be your one top tip if you had a parent at the moment that was struggling and they're parenting and things are tricky and maybe they're worried about their kids' communication side of
mm.
things and they're worried about that, or they might have been newly diagnosed or those kind of things. What would be your top tip for a parent at the moment?
I think I think I kind of lean into kindness, as we've just spoken about, but also being curious.
Yeah,
Like, be curious about your feelings.
yeah,
Like, think about that, get curious about what's showing up for you, curious about what's going on with your kids, and curious about what's out there that could help, like what services and how you find out information about that. Because through curiosity we learn. And so you will, if you're getting curious, you're going to be Googling things, you're going to be looking on Facebook, on social media, you're going to be listening to podcasts. And actually, through that curiosity comes the knowledge, which hopefully then empowers you to either reach out to the right professionals who
yeah,
can give you help, or to just give the strategies a go at home that you find out about, and get to know your child and what works for them. Because even professionals don't necessarily know that. We have to try, we have to test things out to know what works. So you can do some of that at home through your own curiosity of learning and your own kind of like, something's going on here. Oh, I wonder what's going on. Let me try that thing I saw about deep pressure. So I'm going to just give some of that. Oh, this all feels a bit difficult. I wonder what's going on. I'm going to try that thing of not talking for a few
yeah,
minutes and just seeing what happens. I think, yeah. So I think, as we said before, the kindness, but I think also like employing curiosity across all the domains of like you, them, so, sort of the systems around you.
yeah, yeah. I'm just thinking about people might be sitting and listening to you, Ruth, or they might be watching us on YouTube because this goes out on YouTube as well. Um, and thinking, oh, I'd like to just know a bit more about Ruth. Now, there's some exciting stuff that I didn't know about until you messaged me just before we came on that you I might have a book coming. Not
Yeah,
even might, you do.
yeah, yeah.
You do.
It's a bit crazy. I feel like I'm kind of dissociated from it. Yeah, I do. So, it's for speech therapists. It's neurodiversity affirming practice for speech therapists. But I think the information in it would be relevant to teachers, occupational therapists,
Yeah.
like some of the chapters and the content is very speech and language, but some of it is about like social communication and sensory and like neurodiversity affirming concepts and practice.
Mm.
There's a chapter that's been written by a couple of brilliant contributors, Kate and Fatima, on like intersectionality. Kate's also done me a chapter on relationship and sex ed. So there's loads of stuff in there and like
Amazing.
reflective practice. So I think there's probably quite a bit for other professionals as well
Mm.
as speech therapists. And then I have social media, like I don't really know why, like I just use it as a bit of a space. So feel free to come and find me on like
Yeah.
Instagram and
And we'll put all that in the show
TikTok.
notes for everybody so they can find you, Ruth. Because are you mainly Facebook and Insta?
Yeah, I have got TikTok, but I dabble, I'd say.
Yeah, me too. TikTok frightens me. I think I'm too old for it. Every
Yeah,
so often I go
yeah.
in and then think, no, no,
I
too
don't know
old,
what
Liz.
trend is and
Yeah,
what this is and like yeah, hashtags and yeah, like I
I feel
grew
as
up on MSN
well.
Messenger, so
I don't know about you with TikTok. I feel like I do these, I spend ages trying to do it all and it's all lots of information. And then I get like 10 views. And then
yeah,
I watch somebody else who's just basically put a music on, bit of music on, and mouths to it and dances, and they get like 20,000 views. And I just think,
yeah,
"Ah, I'm done with
yeah.
that.
No, no, no.
I'm
Yeah,
going back to
that's it.
Facebook.
That's it. And I hope that then through parents and professionals employing some curiosity, they will just happen upon me, which I know is
Yeah.
not how the algorithm works, but
And work-wise, Ruth, do you work independently with kids now? So you obviously got you work independently, but you work in a school, is that right?
yeah, I'm still independently. So a school, I do some school contracts. So schools
That's what I
will
mean. Yeah.
contract me in, and I go and do my work. And then yeah, sort of one-to-one family work.
Okay.
Although most of my children, in fact, all the kids on my caseload now are in schools or in earlier settings. So I've worked with
Okay.
them from like when they were in like nursery and
Yeah.
preschool through they're now getting into like year one and year two. So yeah, for
Wow.
quite a long time.
And I wonder as well, I'm just thinking about your book, because although you said, it'd be relevant for speeches and OT, sometimes as well it might be relevant for parents. Just thinking about staying curious
Yeah, yeah,
and,
yeah.
knowing what you might want to have in a speech and language therapist
Well, just as
would
you
be
said
quite
that,
good
thinking
to read it.
actually, yeah, yeah, because then you're like, are people aware? Like,
Yeah.
how do they work? Like,
Mm.
and what's their way of working? Because, you know, I feel like quite often, like the algorithm and the bubble in which I live makes me feel like everybody's doing it this way and learning and doing things differently, and it's not the case.
No.
So yeah, like it definitely is one that, people
Yeah.
might find some helpful strategies or
Yeah.
some ways of viewing their child and their
Yeah.
child's differences,
Yeah.
and find, yeah, just things they could ask a therapist about, or even explore with their therapist if
Yeah.
you've got a therapist you're working with. Oh, I
Yeah.
read this, or, I wonder about your take on
It
this,
might be
because
the kind of book that you kind of wave under a few noses of
yeah,
professionals that you're with.
yeah,
Oh, have you seen
yeah.
this really good book?
Yeah, I'm not necessarily right, but I like to think it's well thought out and
Yeah.
takes in the evidence and my working experience and the voice of the neurodivergent community. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Sounds
I've done my best
amazing.
with it. Hopefully, it'll be good enough.
Good enough. Good enough. I'm sure it's going to be amazing. It sounds amazing. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about it.
Oh, thanks.
I suppose that will just leaves me to say thank you ever so much, Ruth, for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on. It's nice to talk speech and language and OT.
Yeah,
I know we've kind of gone through a bit of a up and down and roundabout kind of what things we've spoken about in there, but I think at the crux of that, there's a lot of information in there from Ruth around speech and language therapy, around communication and around neurodivergence, and that being your real kind of area of expertise and your niche that in specialism. So thank you ever so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. We'll put all of Ruth's socials and ways to contact her in the show notes so you can reach out to her if you want to. And then just leaves me to say thank you very much, Ruth.
oh, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
You're very welcome. Thank you for listening and choosing to spend your time with me today. If you enjoyed this episode, please do share it with a friend who might just feel reassured to know that they aren't on their own. And if you've got a moment, a quick rating or a review helps others to find the podcast too. If you want to stay in the loop with the podcast updates and all things Untypical OT, just drop me an email and I'd be really happy to add you to the list. Take care, and I'll see you soon.